Dawn breaks over the East China Sea on April 6, 1945, and with the first pale light comes a silence that every sailor in Task Force 58 knows will not last. The radar picket destroyers sit far out from the main body of the Fifth Fleet, thin steel sentinels stationed 16 miles forward, exposed by design. On their bridges and in their combat information centers, men stare at glowing radar screens and empty horizons, fully aware that today the enemy will come in numbers never seen before. Inside the USS Lee, radar operators watch the scope blue with contacts. Not a handful, not a squadron, but hundreds, converging like a living storm. Below decks, 5-inch gun crews work with a quiet intensity, lifting shells stenciled with 2 cryptic letters VT. Inside each shell is something no Navy has ever relied on before. A miniature electronic brain, a radio transmitter small enough to survive being hurled from a gun barrel at 20,000 times the force of gravity. The mission is brutally simple. Survive the first Kikasui. Operation Kikasui No. 1, the opening blow in a campaign of mass suicide that will decide the fate of Okinawa and perhaps the war itself. At 0600 hours, the sky comes alive. Through the early haze rolls a sound that will haunt survivors for the rest of their lives, the deep, relentless drone of hundreds of aircraft engines advancing in layered waves. These are not pilots expecting to land. These are men sealed into cockpits with no return planned, flying straight toward the densest concentration of anti-aircraft fire ever assembled. Leading them are pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Attack Units, Flying Zero fighters and Yokosuka D-4Y dive bombers, each packed with 250-kilogram bombs. Behind them come older trainers and obsolete aircraft, pressed into service as flying coffins. And among them, carried beneath the bellies of Mitsubishi G-4M Betty, bombers, are the most terrifying weapons Japan has ever fielded. Rocket-powered Oka flying bombs, piloted missiles designed for one-way impact at nearly 600 miles per hour. What happens next will expose a truth Japan cannot escape, that courage, faith, and willingness to die mean little when confronted by a revolution in technology. The revolution arrived not with fanfare, but with electronics. The American VT proximity Fuze, now deployed across the Pacific Fleet, is the culmination of one of the most secret and ambitious programs of the war. Its origins stretch back to 1940, to a desperate crash project launched by Section T of the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory under physicist Merle Tuve. Alongside radar and the atomic bomb, the proximity Fuze would become one of the 3 most important technological secrets of World War II. Its concept was elegant to the point of genius. Instead of relying on timed detonations or direct impact, the shell would emit continuous radio waves. As those waves reflected off an aircraft, the returning signal would shift in frequency. When the Doppler shift reached a specific threshold, when the shell was close enough, the fuse would detonate automatically. The shell did not need to hit the aircraft. It only needed to pass near it. For the first time in naval warfare, near misses became lethal, making that idea work bordered on the impossible. The fuse had to survive being fired from a 5-inch gun, accelerating from rest to over 2,600 feet per second, while spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. Inside, delicate glass vacuum tubes, many manufactured by Sylvania, had to endure forces that would shatter ordinary electronics instantly. Then the fuse had to function flawlessly in Arctic cold, tropical heat, driving rain, and salt spray. Every component had to wake up after launch, power itself, transmit, receive, calculate, and detonate all in a flight lasting less than 30 seconds. Engineers were told it could not be done. They did it anyway. By the spring of 1945, American industry had turned this scientific miracle into mass production. More than 15 million proximity fuses had been manufactured for naval use in the Pacific. Crossley Corporation alone produced over 5 million, nearly a quarter of the total output, while RCA, General Electric, Eastman Kodak, Mackay Norris, and dozens of others filled specialized roles. In total, 110 factories across 87 companies were involved, running around the clock. What began as a $732 device in 1942 was now being produced for just $18 a unit through sheer industrial scale. By Okinawa, 3/4 of all American heavy anti-aircraft ammunition carried VT fuses. Every destroyer, cruiser, and battleship sailed with thousands of electronic shells ready to be fired. Japan, by contrast, had turned to sacrifice. After annihilating defeats in the Marianas and the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy had lost most of its carriers and its veteran pilots. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi concluded that conventional tactics were finished. In October 1944, he proposed something radical and horrifying: special attack units, where pilots would deliberately crash into enemy ships. The logic seemed sound. Conventional attacks had achieved hit rates of barely 2% against American task forces. Early kamikaze strikes in the Philippines had reached success rates exceeding 30%. One Zero fighter and one pilot could cripple or sink a destroyer. In a war Japan was already losing, suicide seemed efficient. Training reflected desperation. Many pilots had fewer than 100 flight hours, compared to the 500 or more of their predecessors. They were taught basic navigation, target recognition, and the final dive. The rest was spiritual preparation, letters home, sake ceremonies, headbands bearing the rising sun, samurai swords pressed into trembling hands. They were told their sacrifice would turn the tide. They were not told about VT fuses. Now, over Okinawa, the two philosophies collide. American ships form layered rings of defense, radar pickets on the perimeter, carriers and battleships at the core. When radar contacts appear, the pickets open fire at maximum range 12,000 yards, filling the air with proximity-fused shells. Each shell becomes a sphere of death 70 feet across, more than 3 times the lethal radius of traditional time-fused ammunition. The sky erupts in black bursts that seem to appear exactly where the aircraft will be. Formations disintegrate. Planes fall burning into the sea miles short of their targets. Yet they keep coming. At 0744, the destroyer USS Laffey is attacked by 22 aircraft in just 80 minutes. Her gun crews fire 345 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition, destroying 9 attackers outright. The fuse allows the guns to shift instantly from one target to another without resetting timers. When kamikaze pilots skim the waves to evade radar, VT shells detonate near the sea surface, throwing up curtains of fragments that tear aircraft apart. Laffey is hit 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs, but she survives. Without proximity fuses, she would not have. This is not luck. The technology had proven itself years earlier. On January 5, 1943, off Guadalcanal, USS Helena fired the first proximity-fused shells in combat. Lieutenant Red Cochrane's battery destroyed a Japanese dive bomber without scoring a direct hit. The shell simply passed close enough. That moment validated years of work and unlocked a future where anti-aircraft fire no longer relied on guesswork. By Okinawa, the mathematics were undeniable. Time-fused shells required over 1,000 rounds per kill. VT shells cut that to roughly 300. In optimal conditions, a kamikaze could be destroyed with just 2 proximity-fused rounds. Ships equipped with VT ammunition were 3 times more likely to survive concentrated attacks. Crews learned to create walls of explosions, continuous barriers no aircraft could pass through unscathed. For Japanese pilots who survived aborted missions, the experience was terrifying. They described flying into solid walls of detonations, shells bursting with impossible precision. Tactics that once worked high speed, low altitude, no longer mattered. Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki recorded in his diary that American defensive fire had become devastatingly effective. Losses mounted. Success rates fell. The promise of guaranteed impact collapsed. And still, the attacks continued. Nearly 300 suicide aircraft launched in the first Kikasui alone. By campaign's end, almost 2,000 would be expended. But the technological balance had shifted irrevocably. Japan could not counter electronic shells with courage alone. The outcome over Okinawa was not decided by spirit, but by factories, laboratories, and engineers. Each VT fuse represented a belief that technology could preserve life by ending threats sooner and farther away. Each kamikaze represented the opposite belief that human sacrifice could overcome material inferiority. Over the waters of the East China Sea, one philosophy would prove tragically obsolete. As the Okinawa campaign grinds on through April, May, and into June of 1945, the clash between human sacrifice and electronic precision becomes brutally clear. Each successive Kikasui operation brings fewer illusions and more wreckage. Japanese planners attempt variation after variation dawn attacks, multi-axis approaches, mixed formations of conventional bombers and suicide aircraft, but nothing alters the underlying reality. Every time a kamikaze pilot pushes his aircraft into the final run, he flies not toward a ship, but into a mathematical problem already solved against him. American radar operators track, calculate, and hand targets to gun directors with mechanical calm. 5-inch guns elevate and fire in rhythmic cycles, shells screaming upward, each one carrying a self-contained radio brain that needs no prayer, no courage, no guidance beyond physics itself. The sky above the fleet becomes a shifting lattice of detonations, an invisible geometry of lethal proximity. Nowhere is this clearer than in the stories that spread among the fleet like legend. On May 11th, the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley faces one of the heaviest kamikaze assaults of the campaign. For 52 minutes, her guns fire almost without pause. Gun crews claim 17 confirmed kills, many destroyed before they ever enter effective dive range. The technique is refined on the fly continuous leading fire, building a moving wall of VT bursts that attackers must fly through. Aircraft explode above, below, and beside the shell's flight paths, caught by detonations that seem uncannily timed. The ship survives, battered but afloat, because proximity fuses turn seconds into eternity and near misses into death. On the USS Aaron Ward, 40 kamikaze aircraft attack in waves. Her 5-inch batteries fire continuously for nearly an hour. 6 attackers are obliterated outright. 5 more are crippled badly enough to crash short. The commanding officer later states flatly that without VT fuses, the ship would have been overwhelmed in minutes. These are not exaggerations born of stress. They are sober assessments from officers who understand exactly what kind of firepower stood between survival and annihilation. Across the fleet, the pattern repeats. Ships that maintain healthy stocks of proximity-fused ammunition survive attacks that would otherwise doom them. Ships that exhaust VT rounds and revert to time fuses suffer dramatically higher casualties. The destroyer USS Drexler, after expending her VT supply, is struck and sunk in less than a minute by 2 kamikazes. 158 sailors die. The lesson is cruelly clear. The fuse is not a marginal improvement. It is the margin between survival and disaster. Japanese commanders see the numbers. By late April, naval intelligence estimates that fewer than 1 in 4 kamikaze aircraft reach their targets, compared to 1 in 3 during earlier campaigns. The reason is consistently identified as a new type of American anti-aircraft shell that explodes with impossible accuracy. Vice Admiral Ugaki notes grimly that safe approach distances no longer exist. Pilots begin reporting that shells detonate exactly where they fly, as if guided by invisible hands. The psychological effect is devastating. Kamikaze doctrine depends on belief that sacrifice guarantees impact. When that belief collapses, the tactic collapses with it. Japan attempts a final adjustment. Pilots are instructed to climb to high altitude before diving vertically, hoping to minimize exposure time. Instead, the tactic backfires. High altitude approaches give radar more warning, fighters more interception time, and ships more maneuvering space. Accuracy plummets, losses rise. The Oka flying bomb, once feared as unstoppable, becomes a liability. Its short range forces Betty bombers to penetrate deep into American defenses, where radar-guided fighters annihilate them long before release. Entire squadrons are wiped out without scoring a single hit. The industrial disparity behind these outcomes is staggering. By June 1945, American factories are producing 70,000 proximity fuses per day. More than 22 million will be built by war's end, at a total cost exceeding $1 billion wartime dollars. What Japan lacks is not understanding but capacity. Japanese scientists grasp the concept of proximity detonation, but they cannot miniaturize electronics, cannot produce shock-resistant vacuum tubes, cannot field reliable radar systems to support such weapons. Their most advanced radar operates at wavelengths unsuitable for miniaturization. Their best anti-aircraft guns still rely on mechanical time fuses, little changed since the early 1930s. The contrast becomes almost symbolic on April 7, 1945, when the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, sails on her final mission. She bristles with anti-aircraft guns and fires thousands of rounds at attacking American aircraft. Fewer than 10 attackers are shot down. The Americans lose roughly the same number of planes while sinking the pride of the Imperial Navy. It is a technological verdict rendered in steel and flame. American commanders understand what they are witnessing. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner writes that without the VT fuse, losses would have been unbearable. Admiral Mark Mitcher credits proximity-fused fire with saving his task forces repeatedly. Admiral Arleigh Burke later recalls that entire waves of aircraft were destroyed by 5-inch guns alone, long before reaching close-in defenses. The proximity fuse turns every destroyer into a lethal guardian, every cruiser into a mobile fortress. Beyond tactics, the fuse reshapes morale. American sailors know they have a fighting chance. Japanese pilots increasingly know they do not. Post-war letters reveal growing doubt among young men sent on suicide missions. They understand, too late, that their deaths are unlikely to matter. The calculus that once justified kamikaze tactics, high probability of impact, has been erased by electronics. When success rates drop below 20%, sacrifice becomes futile, even by the brutal logic of total war. As planners in Washington prepare for the invasion of Japan, they factor proximity fuses into every calculation. Intelligence estimates predict 10,000 suicide aircraft reserved for homeland defense. Production schedules aim for 100,000 VT fuses per day by September. New models with greater reliability are already entering service. The invasion fleet would carry over 1 million proximity-fused shells, forming an anti-aircraft shield unprecedented in history. Japanese post-war assessments admit the truth. Success rates would likely fall below 10%. The tactic would be militarily meaningless. The atomic bomb ends the war before this final test occurs, but the proximity fuse has already done its work. It has preserved ships, saved lives, and shattered the premise that human sacrifice can defeat industrialized technology. Its legacy extends far beyond Okinawa. The concept of weapons that sense, decide, and act autonomously becomes foundational. Modern proximity fuses, guided missiles, and close-in defense systems all trace their lineage to the VT fuse. For Japan, the lesson is bitter but transformative. Veterans later admit their astonishment. Shells seemed alive. Electronics defeated faith. The belief that spirit could overcome matter died over the Pacific. For America, the lesson reinforces a worldview that scientific knowledge, industrial capacity, and organized problem-solving can decide wars. In the final accounting, Kamikaze attacks sink 36 American ships and damage hundreds more. Nearly 5,000 sailors die. These losses are horrific but survivable. Without proximity fuses, projections suggest far worse. Japanese losses are absolute. Nearly 2,000 aircraft and pilots are expended in organized attacks, achieving tactical damage but strategic failure. A proximity fuse weighs less than 5 pounds, contains roughly 130 components, costs $18 by 1945, and functions for seconds. A kamikaze aircraft represents years of training, tons of material, and a human life. Multiply that equation thousands of times, and the outcome becomes inevitable. Over Okinawa, electronics defeat fatalism. The divine wind meets the invisible hand of radio waves and shrapnel. And in that collision, modern warfare reveals its truth. In the age of industry, technology, not sacrifice, decides who survives.